This webinar focuses on using Woodcock-Johnson 4 achievement and oral language results to write your evaluation report. We will look at some sample scores and discuss what we might say about them in a report. Pause this webinar to print out the sample scores handout. The link will be located on the same page where you found the link to this webinar. Then review the scores. Please note that these scores come from Riverside for training and are not in the format we would choose. We would include percentiles and the ranges. We would not include the grade equivalents, as these are more misleading than helpful. Highlight or circle the scores you would report in the test results section of your evaluation. Restart the webinar when you're ready to hear what we think. Let's talk about reporting scores for our sample student in the body of your report. Remember, when writing the body of the academic section, we need to do two things. We need to tell parents what scores mean and then connect test scores to other data to give the big picture of the student's present level of performance. First, tell a parent what skills are measured by tests that are strengths and weaknesses for their student. Rather than include a generic list of what the subtests measure, include this description when you're interpreting the scores and stick to the subtests that are most relevant for the student. Remember, when you're describing tests, that the Woodcock-Johnson is copyrighted and items need to stay secure to preserve the integrity of the test. You cannot include actual test items in the report, and you should not show protocols to parents unless they ask about a specific issue. For our sample student, we would report the 8 cluster scores for reading, writing, math, oral expression, and listening comprehension. We'd first indicate that the student's ability to understand what he hears and to use language to label pictures and to restate what he hears are within the average range. Be careful to note that the oral expression tests really measure the student's expressive vocabulary and short-term memory more than the student's ability to use expressive language to communicate with others. If your student has difficulty in oral expression, you'll want to describe the skills that the tests are measuring. Back to our sample student, we would report subtest scores for the basic reading skills and reading comprehension, but not for fluency. We'd then say in our discussion that testing indicates that reading words, particularly irregular words that cannot be sounded out phonetically, would be very difficult, and that our student struggles to understand what he reads. We see a difference between reading comprehension tests that suggests that the student can understand what he is reading well enough to retell it, but he may struggle with making inferences when he has to draw conclusions from what he reads. Use caution, though, in drawing conclusions based on subtest scores, as they are less reliable than cluster scores. If this is consistent with classroom teacher observations or BAS data, it might be worth mentioning. This kiddo's comprehension problems are less likely to be memory-based and more likely to be based on difficulties with reasoning and thinking beyond the tests. Finally, and somewhat surprisingly, this student's reading fluency was at the low end of average. Again, we wouldn't report the subtest scores because they were so similar. The RPI scores tell us, though, that he would not likely be a fluent reader at grade level. The average standard score tells us that a sizable chunk of third graders in the norm group weren't reading fluently at grade level. We wouldn't report subtest scores for math, but would point out the differences between the two math clusters, again because the subtest scores were so similar to the cluster scores. Our student seems to be better at solving math facts in isolation and has more difficulty applying his math skills to solve real-world problems. However, even his math calculation skills are somewhat limited, and calculating without a calculator may be difficult. Note the RPI scores. We would look at the protocol for math calculation to determine what types of problems he could solve and would note those and the problems that gave our student difficulty in the evaluation report. We would report the written expression cluster score and the spelling subtest score to say that our student could write sentences to convey ideas but might struggle with spelling correctly. As we report the scores and state what they tell us about the student's skills, we'd connect the test data to classroom and observation data in each skill area to ensure that they showed the same pattern. We'd report BAS scores, data from writing samples, and teacher report of classroom performance. We'd also say what we observed the student doing during reading, writing, and math activities. Think of answering the big questions. What do we know about how this child reads? What do we know about how this child solves math problems? What do we know about how the student writes? Your test scores are a piece of this picture, but certainly not the whole picture. It's one thing to report a score, it's another to say what that low score means. In the test results section, you just state the scores and describe what those scores say about the task of reading in the classroom. For example, In the test results section, you might say, Joan scored poorly on letter word ID, but she scored within the average range on reading comprehension subtests. This shows that while she may not be able to read each word correctly, she is able to understand what she reads. The summary should start to get at the why. Why is she struggling with letter word ID? If we have a basic psychological processing data that suggests a processing deficit might impact a student's skill development, we could say that here. We might say that Joan could be struggling to decode words because she has difficulty remembering letter patterns. We'd also probably note that she has poor spelling and connect the poor spelling and the poor decoding to the underlying weakness in processing. Making these connections is often tenuous though, so make connections when they're clear, but avoid hypothesizing when the data doesn't clearly point you in a certain direction. The summary would also be the place to note that the student has poor attention to task and that this could be impacting his reading, math, and writing skills. Remember, you're summarizing and interpreting results. There are lots of reasons kids don't do well. Sometimes we have a good idea what those are, and sometimes we don't. If we do have a good idea, make those connections here. Those connections will point the reader in the direction of your eligibility statements. Let's look more closely at our sample student. How can we put the different test scores together to draw some conclusions to include in the summary and interpretation section? Pause this for a few minutes and take a look at the sample score report. What patterns do you notice that might indicate some of the why behind the student's learning? I realize you can only go so far as you just have achievement data in front of you. Given the low letter word identification and reading fluency, we might question whether the student's comprehension was being impacted by poor basic reading skills. The student's background knowledge, as assessed here by Science, Social Studies, and Humanities subtests, is average. We might also look at the cognitive verbal scores to get a sense of the student's background knowledge and verbal reasoning. We could look at working memory testing from the cognitive battery to get an idea of memory skills. The student's sentence repetition score was on the low end of average, as was the reading recall score, both suggesting that memory may not be a strength, but doesn't look like a major weakness. Interestingly, the speed of lexical access scores on page 1 could also suggest a processing deficit related to reading. If the student cannot quickly retrieve information from memory, this will slow down reading fluency. Research has shown that this is a strong relationship to reading, the speed of lexical access. Again, this is part of the oral reading subtest, and the scores are on page 1. Finally, you'd also consider what you observed about the student's attention during testing in the classroom course. In the area of math, the RPI scores again suggest that math in the classroom will be very difficult. Interestingly, we might not be too concerned about the 90 standard score for calculation, but the RPI tells us that we should be concerned. For this student, math problem solving is an obvious concern, but we wouldn't want to overlook the calculation skills. As the student gets older, we may want to informally test calculation skills using a calculator to determine if this is a barrier to problem solving. We might look at nonverbal reasoning testing from the IQ to make a connection with the low problem solving scores. We also might connect the low problem solving to the low reading comprehension and make a statement about how his difficulty thinking beyond what is written impacts him in both reading and math. In writing, the RPI shows that the gap between the student and his classmates isn't insurmountable in content, but is fairly wide in spelling. The spelling gap is not surprising given his poor word recognition skills. Hopefully, we would recommend working on these skills together. We do see some connections that show an underlying processing deficit related to memory for letters and retrieval of information from memory. Remember, in a perfect world, the why is this student struggling points us in the direction of eligibility. If the data shows that the student struggles most after absences, which are too frequent, our why might point us towards saying the student does not have a disability, but is missing instruction due to frequent absences. If our data points us towards a processing deficit that is specific to certain skills, we have a stronger case for eligibility for SLD. Finally, if anxiety seems to be underlying the low scores, we may move away from SLD and more towards EBD. Next, let's look at how to use WJ scores to support eligibility, beginning with SLD. That can be found in the next webinar.